My name's Robbie Luckett. I'm professor of history and director of the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University. Today is September the 17th, 2021. It is 8 a.m. Central Time. I'm with Sam Black. Sam, would you, for our record, state your name and spell it for us?
Okay, my name is Samuel W. Black, S-A-M-U-E-L, middle initial W, B-L-A-C-K.
Do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes.
Let's begin with some background information. Can you tell us a little bit about where you were born, how you grew up, what your family life was like, your educational background, those kinds of things?
Oh, sure. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, 1961. Attended Frederick Douglass Elementary School until I was in the 3rd grade. And at that time, my family moved to a different community. So I attended a different elementary school, a primary school where for 1 year for 4th grade, and then went to the community elementary school, which was called Bond Hill. And then went to the junior high school, they called them back in those days, not middle schools. So I had 7th and 8th grade at Crest Hills Junior High. And then I attended Woodward High School and graduated from Woodward High School in 1979. From there, I attended Wilmington College in Ohio for 3 years, and then transferred to the University of Cincinnati. And when I transferred, I changed my major because coming out of high school, I was interested in studying architecture. And, but I was also recruited to play football. And so I decided myself and one of my best friends to enroll at Wilmington College because we were recruited to play football there, but they didn't have an architectural program. So the 3 years that I was there, I basically majored in what they called industrial supervision. And within that program, you could choose one of a number of different like specialties. And one of mine was art and industrial supervision. Basically what I was trying to do was find what was comparable to architecture. And so I have a huge art background. When I was in high school, I won a couple of awards. The newspaper down there, the Cincinnati Enquirer, had these competitions for high school students, and I won a couple of those for my artwork. So I was already, really interested in art anyway. And when things just didn't work out for me, I was really dissatisfied because I felt that I had a cousin who was a professional architect. And he was saying, if you want to go in this field, you need to get into a real architectural program. This thing you're doing at Wilmington College ain't gonna cut it. So that's why I transferred to the University of Cincinnati, and I went into Cincinnati had 2 architectural programs. They had design, art, architecture, and planning. And then they had another college called the Ohio College of Applied Science. So I went into applied science, and it was much more on the engineering part of architecture, whereas design, architecture, and art was more theoretical. So I went through that program and received a associate's degree. You can do an associate's and a bachelor's degree. But by this time, I guess I was maybe a year into my associate degree, and I found out, you could take electives your electives doesn't have to be at the Ohio College of Applied Science. They could be on the main campus. So I decided started taking African American Studies courses, art history, politics, Kiswahili, all these courses that were offered, and I was doing pretty well. So at the same time I got my associate's degree, I then transferred over to African American Studies. So I completely left the architectural behind, and decided to pursue a bachelor's degree in African American Studies, and that's what I did. And it took me a lot longer. I was no longer eligible under the Pell Grant to receive federal funding, because now I'm over 21 years old, right? So I worked nights and went to school during the day, and I did that for, I think, 4 years maybe. But anyway, I did receive my degree with honors from the University of Cincinnati in African American Studies. And from there, I went into the public schools where I taught for 2 years. I think it was 2 years. And started out in a specially funded program that was designed to keep students from dropping out of school. This was at the middle school level, so I had 7th and 8th graders. And I was teaching, because I had the applied science background, I was teaching science and math. And I kind of enjoyed it. It was a little wild. It was an interesting school. It was a school that when I was in school, that was a part of town I had no interest in going into. And because it was a little weird, it was predominantly, the residential portion surrounding the school was predominantly Appalachian. The students were about 70% African American, so they bused these students from the Black community into this Appalachian community. So you had this weird mixture of things. And part of the reason they wanted to start this dropout prevention programs, because they had 8th graders who, quite frankly, they had 8th graders walking around with mustaches. They were like 17 years old. Kids who were held back constantly, and who were only in the school for their reasons and not to get an education or anything like that. So there were a lot of social issues there. So I went on and took that position, and was trying to develop my own strategy, on how to teach these kids who really didn't care about learning. And the principal came to me and asked if I would be interested. She had been noticing me, it was her words, if I would be interested in starting an after-school program, because they were looking for someone, especially a Black male, to have an impact on these kids. And the other Black male teachers, people who have been teaching for over 20 years, were just not interested. So here I am, the new kid. I didn't know any better. So I jumped in, yeah, okay, we'll do it. She gave me a budget, $100 for the whole year, $100 budget. So I said, okay, I'm gonna have to use my connections, right? And so what we wind up doing was starting a club for boys called the Young Men's Club. And we had speakers come in. I met with teachers, told them what I was doing, asked if there were children who were on the verge of dropping out, kids who were, especially those who were over age, and the ones that we felt needed most to be impacted by this program. And they identified them. So I arranged to have professional men, because I was also a member of the Black Male Coalition, which was a group of professional men in the city of Cincinnati. You had judges, you had professional athletes, businessmen, people from all walks of life, college professors. So I went to my Black Male Coalition meeting and I told the gentleman about, what we were doing at the school. A lot of them who were from Cincinnati knew about the school, they knew the reputation, some had even attended there. So I had volunteers to come in and help tutor some of the kids. So I had engineers who helped out in math classes. I had businessmen and attorneys who helped out in English class. They would come in and they would come in during the class period and assist the teacher. They were like teachers' assistants. So it worked out real well. And then I started in our after school meetings, bringing in guest speakers. So I brought in an executive from Procter & Gamble. And that kind of went okay to a certain degree. But I kind of told him afterwards, I wish he wouldn't have driven his shiny white Mercedes-Benz up there because it distracted the kids, for the real purpose that he was there. And he was a computer guy. And this was in 1989, I think. And so he was a computer guy, which was real early in that phase of technology. But that's what he did at Procter & Gamble, was that he had set up, he was like, I guess you would say, an IT person, but he was building their computer system at Procter & Gamble, and he had risen up to be a vice president of a company. So he's very well-to-do African-American, told his life story, which was really fascinating. One of the other meetings I brought in a member of the Cincinnati Bengals, and this was the year after they played in the Super Bowl, lost to the 49ers in the Super Bowl. So he came in to talk about what it's like to be a professional athlete and play in the Super Bowl, all that type of thing. And then at the end of the year, I went to my principal and I said, these kids have really put in the effort here. And it was, we had some kids, like the school bully, who no one took the time to really get to know this kid. They just saw him as a school bully. With bullies, there's always some backstory. And the backstory was that this guy's mother was dying of cancer. So he just had these emotions, and anyone who was an adult was seen as the enemy, and but he was one heck of a football player. And so I convinced him to join the Young Men's Club, and then I made him president because I said, I'm gonna give him some real responsibility, and before his responsibility was only to himself, as he went around walking the hallways, knocking people into lockers and things like that. And then he began to change. And that's how I found out his backstory, was having these conversations. I used to drive him home after our meetings, and we had these conversations, and he said, Mr. Black, the main thing I really want, I want to be one of those kids at the end of the year who get one of those certificates, straight A's or perfect attendance, whatever. That's what I want. So I said, okay, we'll work on that. But I say all this to say that, all of that preceded my venture into museums, because I left Schwab Middle School to go to graduate school. And my principal, who didn't really like it but she was going to support me to go to graduate school. And she said, you know what, I'll hold your job. You go to grad school, you come back, you can do some more dynamic things here. I said, yeah, we can raise more than $100. So I went to grad school at SUNY Albany in New York, and got my master's in Africana Studies, concentrating in African history. And came back and called my principal, and she had taken retirement. She took the buyout. What happened was that a new superintendent came in while I was in grad school, put a hiring freeze on, offered senior educators the opportunity, someone like my principal, to either go back into the classroom or, take this buyout. And that's what she did. She's like, I'm not going back into the classroom. So I couldn't get my job back, basically. So I worked for a short time period, maybe like 6 months or so, as a social worker with the Citizens Committee on Youth, which is public social service agency in Cincinnati. And I did that. And one of the things I did was I put together a rites of passage program for one of the community centers, again, in one of the more distressed neighborhoods. And right before I was going to implement it, I had applied for a job at the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. And, applied and completely forgot about it, And then they contacted me and wanted me to come up to Cleveland for an interview. And I said, sure. But I had no idea, other than part of my CCY duties was working at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Cincinnati. And I conducted a summer program on the history of Blacks in Cincinnati. And I had 5 high school students as part of my team, and we taught them how to do oral histories. We taught them how to produce videos. We taught them research and all these other things. And part of the research thing was a visit to the Cincinnati Historical Society, where we met with the director of the archives, and he gave us a tour. This was not only good for these kids, it was my first ever venture inside of an archive. And, so he took us on this tour of the stacks and everything. And I'm like, wow, things are going through my mind, just connecting with, I like research, there's all this. So I told my kids, I said, you know what, you all don't take advantage of this opportunity and even I'm going into this area. So that's pretty much what happened. And so I went for my interview at the Western Reserve and got hired in June of 1992 as the associate curator for African American history. And my supervisor was John Grabowski, who was still there, as a matter of fact. When I got there in 92, John, who started there when he was in graduate school at Case Western Reserve University, in the, I think, late 60s, maybe. So John has been there since the late 60s. And he now has a chair at Case Western Reserve University, and he's gone in and out of the Western Reserve Historical Society. But one of the things he did was able to connect the university with the Historical Society. I think they call it the Cleveland History Center now. So I started there in June of 92, and it was really great. I mean, it was absolutely great. I was the curator for the papers of Carl Stokes and Lewis Stokes and Zelma George, and all of these people that you read about, in the history books. And I had a chance to meet these folk, and sit in Carl Stokes's kitchen and drink coffee as he tells me about, a little bit about his career. And Lewis Stokes was a little more, because he was a congressman, I think, he had a different personality than his brother. His brother, who when I was in his kitchen, I think Clinton had just named him as ambassador to Seychelles and Mauritius. Allen's. And so that's why I was there. I was collecting another portion of his personal papers. And we, had a chance to sit down and talk a little bit. Excuse me. So I stayed at the Western Reserve from 92 to 2002. And then I moved to Pittsburgh. And a couple of reasons I moved to Pittsburgh was my then fiance, who's now my wife, had accepted a job. She and I met in Akron, Ohio, when she was beginning a postdoc at Oberlin College. And Oberlin is just, about 40 minutes west of where I lived in Cleveland. And so I used to, even before she was at Oberlin, I used to drive out to Oberlin because the college would do the Black Studies department would do these really great programs and bring in great speakers, and it was free, and so I would drive out to Oberlin and, and then, who's the old man in the audience, everybody else is students, and but I'm like, this is David Du Bois, the stepson of W.E.B. Du Bois, and I can only get this from him, this information, so I'm here, that type of thing. But, my wife was there for a year. I think her postdoc was maybe a year, a little over a year. But anyway, that's where we met and everything. And then when she was at the end of her postdoc, she was on the job market, and Oberlin was one of the schools that had offered her a position. Now her PhD is from Penn. So she's coming from the Ivy League, and she only wanted to go somewhere comparable. And Oberlin, just liberal arts college. It was great, small, Midwestern campus with a lot of history, the whole Underground Railroad thing and all the abolitionist involvement at the college, and one of the first schools to allow African Americans to attend and graduate, and all this type of thing. She was also offered positions at Tulane, Mississippi, in Oxford. I can't remember the other places. And Carnegie Mellon here in Pittsburgh. And Carnegie Mellon wind up giving her the best deal, and it was Research One University and all those types of things. And so, so we're here. She moved to Pittsburgh, and being an Ohio person, I had no interest in Pittsburgh. I kind of liked the Tulane thing because of New Orleans, and I just said, we may not be able to make anything out of our relationship if you go to Mississippi, because I had no interest in going to Mississippi. And so now my wife is from Miami, Florida. And, she her undergraduate degree is from Emory. She then went to University of Florida for a master's, and then went to Penn. She had a few stops in ways, sort of internships at UVA, and she did an internship at the Avery in Charleston, but then went to work on her doctorate at Penn, and graduated from Penn late 90s, I guess, because I was there for graduation. Maybe it was 99. So anyway, she moved to Pittsburgh, and, she did all the house. I didn't even come here to visit. I was just like, so she would commute back to Cleveland on weekends, and then that was, I could see, after maybe like 4 or 5 months, that was starting to, wear and tear on her, and the disinterest in this commute, on weekends, and how come this guy won't come to Pittsburgh for a weekend, And so then we decided, okay, I'll bite the bullet, I'll come visit Pittsburgh. So I did. And basically what I did was I contacted Andy Masick, who is my president and CEO at the Heinz History Center, and told him I wasn't looking for a job, but eventually I'll move to Pittsburgh because my fiance has a job there. We're planning to get married. She's at Carnegie Mellon. I just want to get a little bit lay of the land, talk shop in a sense. So we had a meeting in his office and we talked a little bit about the whole cultural and museum field in Pittsburgh. I also met with the archivist at the University of Pittsburgh and someone from the Museum of Art. And, but I felt comfortable because I like my job in Cleveland and I had built myself up, I had become almost an institution in the city, The archive collecting thing became much easier because after 10 years, I had marketed the program to the extent that people knew that, if Granddad died and Granddad was a Mason, maybe we ought to contact Mr. Black at the Historical Society, instead of putting everything out for the garbage men on Monday morning. And I didn't want to give that up. Plus I had a beautiful lakeside apartment, and my balcony overlooked it. Oh, I'm not gonna get that in Pittsburgh, So there was a lot of material stuff mixed in there. And my wife had to battle with that, And so finally I came here and I think maybe about 30 days after I met with Masick and the other people at Pitt and so forth, he contacted me or the museum contacted me and wanted me to apply for a position as African-American program coordinator. And it was interesting because the program coordinator that they had was on maternity leave. And what they was looking to do was hire a program coordinator while she was on maternity leave. And then we would have to compete for the permanent position after her maternity leave was over. It was the weirdest thing ever heard. And so I said, no, I'm not interested in that. This woman just had a baby and I'm gonna come in, you're gonna give her a job to somebody else. I said, besides, I'm not a programmer, I'm an archivist. I'm the curator of Carl and Lewis Stokes's, papers. Why the heck would I want to do programs? So, I turned them down and they came back and said, okay, we want to change the position to a curatorial position and like for you to come in for an interview. So I said, okay. So I talked to a few people. I think John Fleming was probably one of those I spoke to. When I first interviewed for the Western Reserve position in '92, I had a mentor named Celine Holmes. Celine she was a museum veteran. She helped John Fleming open the museum in Wilberforce. She helped Fleming get started with the Freedom Center. And she went to my high school. So I didn't know her personally. She was older than me. She graduated with my older sisters. So she coached me in '92 for the Western Reserve job. I went back to her for this position. And she said, well, you've been in the field for a long time now. You kind of know the landscape. I said, but this is totally new, situation. And, they're not really hooked into the same places I'm hooked into, like AAAM and all that type of thing. So no one really knows very much about this museum. And so she kind of coached me a little bit, and with Fleming knew about them. And with with the two of them advising me, I went in for a second interview. One thing I did, I wrote my own job description. So I went for the interview, and there was two people interviewing me, and one was a African-American woman who was a member of the Board of Trustees and was also chair of their African-American Advisory Council. The other one was the director of the education division of the museum. And the reason she was interviewing me was because the original position that they were asking me to apply for, that program position, came under her division, under her supervision. So I listened to what they had to say, and then I said, well, if you're really serious about African-American history, they never had this position before, right? They only had people who did programs. They had an archivist in name only. They never had a museum curator of color. And so I gave them my job description, and I said, this is the only thing I would consider, salary and everything. I said, there's no hard feelings if you all don't want to, do this with me. But this is where I am, and this is the only thing I'm interested in. So they said, okay, we'll get back to you. Within a few days, they're asking me to come back to Pittsburgh for another interview, this time with the director of the museum and the chief curator. So I said, okay, you're making some progress, but I'm not backing down on my job description. I think it's a good job description. And as a matter of fact, I think before the interview, I shared it with Fleming, and he thought it was good. So so I go in for the second interview, and they're really excited, about things and about the possibilities. Although most of my experience was in archive, I did some curatorial work, exhibition work, but it was like photograph collections and a few three-dimensional exhibits. But the main thing was I did an exhibit at the University of Akron on, this would have been in time for the 150th anniversary of Sojourner Truth's famous Ain't I a Woman speech in Akron, Ohio in 1853. So she was the center of this exhibition that I designed at the Pan-African Cultural Center at the University of Akron. And it was great because I worked with the archivists at the university. They had already been collecting from the Black community. And so it was easy for me to get into the collections and select things that I wanted for the exhibit, including artifacts. So, so I put this thing together, and it just blew them away. Very small budget. I think the budget is like $10,000 or something like that. So I did this thing, and I also, in a sense, also developed a means for the university to continue to collect, because although they were collecting things from the community, it was primarily like the Black middle class stuff, And I'm like, the majority of the people here, you're not collecting anything from, the churches were only the churches of the sort of elite ministers, and that type of thing. So I said that kind of contradicts Sojourner Truth, and everything. So I'm pointing all this stuff out to them. And I put it in writing too, as sort of a white sheet of how to carry on after the exhibit opens. So anyway, I did that. The people here in Pittsburgh were really impressed with it. And the University of Akron, to my surprise, kept that exhibit up probably for 10 years, maybe. And other than the opening, I had never been back to see it. It's long gone now, but I didn't go back to see it. Once I moved to Pittsburgh, I was too busy. But I was a part of the Ohio Bicentennial Commission at the time that I was making plans to move to Pittsburgh. And so part of what I was doing was they had set up a committee that was looking into the history of African Americans in Ohio. So we had to come up with some type of products or projects or programs or something. So we did it all. One of the products we came up with was a calendar in which was given to me. And my charge was to fill in each day of the year with something significant to Blacks in Ohio. Very difficult thing to do. But, we made some serious progress. And when it came to getting pictures from people like Rita Dove and so forth, they were so cooperative and shared so much information. In addition to that, I don't know if you know Nashani Frazier. Nashani used to be at Miami of Ohio. She's now at the University of Kansas. And Nashani followed me at the Western Reserve as the curator of African American collections. So we got to know each other and got to be good friends. And so Nashani was also on this bicentennial commission, and her charge was to organize state historic markers. So she was asking me which markers I thought needed to be placed and all that stuff. I said, well, we don't have a marker for Charles Chestnut, believe it or not, the novelist, and so that was one. I think we wind up doing maybe 3 or 4 state historic markers. So anyway, I'm in Pittsburgh, but once a weekend a month, I'm traveling to Columbus, Ohio for these meetings of the Ohio Bicentennial Commission. So I wasn't fully 100% devoted to my work in Pittsburgh, and they knew that, and I told them that before they hired me. There were certain things that I wanted. One, I wanted the institution to pay an institutional membership to the Association of African American Museums. This is all part of my contract. Same thing with ASALA. And that they would underwrite my participation on the boards and executive council of these organizations. So all that was written into my first contract, and they agreed to it, including the Ohio Bicentennial thing, which was only going to last a couple of years after I started work there. But anyway, we produced a calendar, and I wind up with a lot of information, to fill in 365 days, but a lot of information on African Americans in Ohio history, stuff I had never even known about, stuff that happened, in my backyard, that I didn't really know much about. So it was really good. And so in 2002, same year that I started here in Pittsburgh, I started in March of 2002. And really interesting thing was, let's see, I started in March of 2002, and I can't remember what the other thing was that year. Yeah, I continue with the Bicentennial Commission, and I can't remember, I lost my train of thought there. But anyway, I start here in 2002 in March, and sort of hit the ground running, because I had 10 years experience and everything. Only thing I had to do was get used to the protocols of that particular institution. No one had to teach me how to, curate or be an archivist or anything like that. So a large part of my job description was building the museum collection, which I didn't do very much of that at the Western Reserve, I did a little bit, but that's only if it was connected to the archival collecting. But so I started that, sort of hit the ground running, and was given an exhibit project, an exhibit that was going to open in January 2003 of traveling quilts. And these were coming out of Kansas City, out of the Nelson Atkins Museum. And but to my surprise, the Heinz History Center, who contracted for this exhibit, hadn't even considered the quilters in the greater Pittsburgh area. So I'm like, I know there's Black quilters everywhere. I know it's gotta be, this is at the height of the whole G's Benz thing, right? So one of the people on the African American Advisory Council was Tina Brewer. And I'm like, Tina Brewer has quilts hanging in the U.S. Embassy in Senegal. How could you not even, and she's on your advisory council. What, I didn't get it, So I talked to Tina, and Tina said, oh yeah, that's, we got an African American Quilt Guild here. We got another guild over there, So she put me in touch with all these quilters, and these women made some beautiful stuff. A couple of men too, some beautiful quilt. I mean, it's everything from the category of fiber art to your traditional quilts. There was a quilt I found, these steel workers. You had like 4 generations of steel workers who started in Birmingham. Then the family migrated in early 20th century to Chicago or Gary, Indiana. They worked in the mills there. Then they came to Pittsburgh and worked in them. So the person I'm talking to, after graduating from high school, went 1 year at Carnegie, at that time called Carnegie Tech, before Carnegie and Mellon University merged. Carnegie Tech and Mellon University or college merged to form Carnegie Mellon in the 60s. And so he brings out this quilt, and it has blocks made from the clothes of all the men in their family going back over 100 years. I'm like, this is amazing, And he said, no, it's not we don't use it or anything, but we bring it out when we have like family gatherings or family reunion, and people talk about, the block represents a certain person and someone talks about that person in the family. Beautiful thing. So those are the types of quilts that and so the traveling exhibit was about 50 quilts. I added an additional 50. And of course, that's going to cause problems because the gallery that they had already designated for this exhibit couldn't hold 100 quilts. So we worked it out where the quilts went outside the gallery into the corridor, down into another corridor. So it just expanded the whole thing, and it wound up being pretty good. And that was sort of my beginnings here at the Western Reserve. I mean, at the Heinz History Center. But at the same time, this was the other thing I want to say about 2002. I began my terms on AAAM Board and ASALA's executive council. And doing both of those at the same time. And I think other than John Fleming, I might have been only the second person to do that. I know Lanisha has gone on to do it, and probably a few others. But I even remember warning Lanisha when she was it depends, but when I was on ASALA's executive council, what's her name? Sheila Fleming was the chair, And she was a real taskmaster. She always had ideas and appoint people. So my job was to develop the guidelines for the institutional partnership between AAAM and ASALH. So I said, well, that's easy for me to do because I'm on both, so in essentially both boards, right? But it didn't turn out to be very easy. But it really laid the groundwork for ASALH's partnerships with the National Park Service and other organizations. And so I'm doing all this at the same time, and then I get married in November 2002. So it's a very busy time. My son is born in February 2003. So so all these things are happening, all at the same time. But there's a transition. This is a transition period for AAAM. I'm not saying because my coming on board in 2002, but what I witnessed was sort of the end of the way things used to be, which was we didn't have an executive director, and we pretty much had sort of a cadre of people who really did the work. And a lot of times in that cadre, it wasn't the president of the organization. And I'll give you an example. When I joined under the presidency of Bill Gwatney. And Gwatney, being with the National Park Service, being that most people in AAAM thought he was white. So all those things caused a little bit of friction underneath everything, The transition was that AAAM, for a long time, its members saw the organization as an exclusively Black organization. And almost like, we are an extension of the Black Panther Party or whatever, And I can't remember what city we were in, but it was during a board meeting. And we had a little break in deliberations. This was probably 2003 or 2004, maybe 2003. And one person on the board said, well, I just don't understand why, you African Americans will work at these mainstream museums. And, and I'm looking around, I'm like, I'm the only one on the board who's working in mainstream museum. Everybody's from a Black museum here or the Smithsonian. And I said, Black museum never offered me a job. We got to do something about that. But see, going all the way back to 1992, my first conference, AAAM conference, there was a panel, and this conference is in Dayton, Ohio. There was a panel about African-American museum professionals in mainstream museums. So naturally, I'm going to attend the panel. And I go and, one side of the room is those of us who work in mainstream museums, the other side of the room are Black museums. And there's like a war going on, they hate us, we're stealing their ideas and giving it to the white man, that type of thing. and so the next year in '93, the conference was in Virginia, Roanoke. And they had a follow-up, let's continue that panel discussion. And so it was at it again, That's where I met Margaret Santiago and a number of others, this whole debate. And but that carried over. By the time I joined the board, there was still a little bit of that on the board, because the board theoretically was originally set up to be directors of Black museums. That's why they called it in the beginning, Board of Directors. They were directors of Black museums. And so it had an agenda to support Black museums. As time went on, you begin to have African Americans who were not working in Black museums. So what do you do with them? It was because of people like Fleming and others who recognized that you can't confine Black museum professionals only inside the Black museum, and that there are Black museum professionals who are outside of the Black museum, but are afraid to relate to AAAM because of this type of hostility. I confess I had a lot of ignorance with this. I didn't know there was hostility when I joined the board or joined AAAM, but it was there a little bit. And so part of my argument as a board member was that it's inevitable that we're going to have to change our bylaws to the degree that it reflects the broadness of the African American museum profession, and that things that would include consultants, that would include people I know of who worked for one entity only. Might be a wealthy family, that might be a wealthy white family, and they're the archivists for that family, or something like that. I know a guy here who has been like for 30 years, he's the archivist for the Heinz family, and he's African American. Nobody knows about it. I didn't know about this. I see this guy all the time in the neighborhood grocery store. He's very quiet, meticulously dressed in there shopping, for his groceries. But I saw him all the time. I saw him on a bus in the community. Next time I see him, he's at the History Center because we're closely connected to the Heinz family, and he's representing the archives. And that's how I got to know what he did. He's been doing this for 30 years. So you have people like that, who are professionals, but not under AAAM. And I saw that that was a weakness in AAAM going forward, that we need to recognize that we are an organization of Black museums, yes, but people who are African-American museum professionals and people, regardless of their race, who are interested in Black museums. So that was something that I quickly noticed in 2002 about the board, and it began to change. It began to change as the board began to change itself. Some of the people who I see as the real glue of the organization around that period, late 1990s, early 2000s, when you begin to have the issues with the legal issues, the reincorporation and all that type of thing, there had to be new blood to come in, and it had to become younger. So when I came on board was a period where you begin to see people like Vilma Fields, what's the lady from Chicago? Man, I can see her face. Anyway, I can't remember her name right now, but those people were beginning to retire. Unfortunately, some of them passed away. Harry Harrison, Jesse, what was Jesse's name? He was at the Cal Berkeley Museum, Jesse Fisher. So these people, they were sort of the transition. And I remember in maybe 2003 or 4, maybe it's 2004, when Kathy Hambrick came on the board. Kathy and I and Michelle Torres Carmona from Sites were probably the youngest people on the board. And, the board still had this membership structure that was regional. Certain number of members from the Southeast, Midwest, West Coast, and that type of thing. I thought that may have worked well in the 80s, but not in the 2000s. There's too many Blacks in the museum field now. You're missing out on the whole talent thing. So I put up that argument for a long time until Kathy became president, and we began working on amending the bylaws to get rid of those things, so that it didn't matter where you were from. So that's why you see the board, at least from my presidency on, well, you might have, 2 or 3 people from the same museum. That never would have happened in the 90s because of the regional thing. So that was one of the things. And then the other was the planning. Debbie Mack was reluctant to join AAAM's board. But before Debbie became a board member, I asked her to join the program committee for the 2006 conference in St. Louis. Now, this was sort of a strategy on my part. And I had the support of the president at the time, Lawrence Pigeot. And I said, we need to have Debbie Mack much more involved in AAAM. So he said he's the one who suggested that we asked her to be on the program committee. I chaired the program committee. So I went to Debbie and I said, we're going to do the program. We're going to do the conference in St. Louis. Jackie Dace is our person on the ground there. We need others on the program committee. I think you'll do well. This is some of the things we want to do in terms of the program. And so she joined and she recommended a few other people like Renee Franklin and a few others. And we had such a good conference. And I remember one of the things I did was a panel that I set up on, I think it was something like tax liabilities for museum professionals. Because the professional, the person, the individual, we never at our conferences talked about the individual's tax liabilities, right? So I contacted the National Association of Black Accountants and asked if they could, the St. Louis branch, right? Because we're gonna be in St. Louis, if they would be interested in doing this panel. I said you could do 2 panels, one for the institution, one for the individual professional. And they was like, we've never done that before. So they wanted to know, who's going to pay for their parking at the hotel. I said, isn't all that tax deductible? This is the type of stuff we need to know, And so they wind up doing it. And but their whole thing was that we're going to be able to solicit clients, right? Instead of doing the daggone thing. So I said, don't worry about that. That's just the gravy that might come along with doing this. I said, besides, these are people from all over the country. They're not from St. Louis, So anyway, they just figured, okay, we're only gonna get like 2 or 3 people show up to this thing. So we had to open the double doors in the back of the room and had chairs out in the hallway. There were so many people interested in this because we were all on the same page. We just didn't know what was exempt, what was deductible, what was a lot of stuff that I do as a museum professional was coming out of my pocket. Is there some way that I can declare these expenses? So they walked us through it and it was really great. That was one of the first times we ever did something like that, where we looked at the individual, the professional, and in terms of the financing and your tax liabilities, what you are responsible for, and I've been telling people, I said, when I do my lectures and research for my lectures, any books I buy, I write them off. I've been doing them for years. I don't know if it's legal, but to me it is, and none of my accountants has ever said it was wrong, you know? So, so we did stuff like that. And then, you know, we had some bumpy roads. You know, one of the things with AAAM had always been funding. And we have been very lucky as an organization that other than that period in the late 90s, early 2000s, that began earlier, but kind of collided at the end of the decade. AAAM really didn't have any financial issues. When I became president in 2016, I had one thing, and I told my wife, you know, we're never going to be in the red. I'm, you know, and she knew it. You know, she's my wife, so she knows I can pinch a penny just like anything, you know, and that, you know, we didn't do any extravagant spending. It's like some board members used to say, well, Sam, how come you paying for your own hotel? Shouldn't the organization, you're the president, shouldn't the organization be doing, I have the money in my budget. You know, this way the organization doesn't have to come out of its pocket, you know, to pay my hotel room when I could do it myself, you know, and that's the way that I always said that it should be, until we got to the point someday where, you know, we can afford to do that, you know, where it's not going to negatively impact the organization's finances. So that was part of my whole thing. And the other thing was what I learned from the older generation in AAAM was that the conference was really set up to support the museum, the hosting museum. That's why it was always a hosting museum involved. And there's been a lot of cities that we had turned down because they didn't have either a Black museum or they didn't have a well-functioning Black museum. There are times where AAAM went to a city where that didn't happen. I mean, there was a Black museum, but the Black museum was a train wreck. And I'll be honest, Cleveland was one of those. And I was in Cleveland at the time they came to Cleveland. And this is how the people at the African American Museum in Cleveland were. I don't know if you're familiar with the landscape there, but the Western Reserve Historical Society is located in an area called University Circle. And maybe half a mile, 3/4 of a mile away is the African American Museum in the Huff community. Huff is where the riots took place in 1966, right? So it was when I moved there in 92, Huff still hasn't fully recovered from 1966. The townhouse complex I moved into was really the only new construction between 66 and the late 80s. I mean, residential construction in that community. You still had the vacant lots where there used to be buildings that have been burned down and all that stuff. So it's on the rebound in the 90s. You're starting to get these sort of suburban style homes, you know, being built and everything. And the African American Museum was still there. And notoriously run by people who had no idea on how to run a museum and who were hiring their friends or girlfriends to be directors, or hiring people because, you know, they had a resume, they were a college graduate or whatever, you know, but no one with real museum experience. And I remember the president of their board, can't remember his name now, but he's the one who turned me on to AAAM. It wasn't my colleagues at the Western Reserve. When he found out I was hired, he contacted me and said, the conference is going to be in Dayton in August. Now I'm hired in June of 92. He calls me and says, you need to be at that conference. So that's how I got to AAAM in August of 1992. Ed Reeves, that was his name. I don't know what he did as a professional, but he was not a museum professional. But he was president of the board at the African American Museum. And And he asked me to be a mentor to a new director they hired. I can't remember what her professional background was, but it had nothing to do with museums or the arts or archives or education or anything like that. She might have been a social worker. But she was very lost. And people would come there to see some of the collections, because the founder of the museum, Ichabod Flewellen, had collected a lot of stuff, including some of the leading Black photographers of the mid-20th century, and had their negatives and prints in file cabinets in the basement of the museum. When people would come over and say, I'm interested in seeing a William Crawford photograph he had taken in 1953, and she would give them the photograph under condition that they would make photocopies and bring it back. And I said, number one rule, an archive is not a library. You do not loan out anything. If they want a copy of that, a print of that photograph, you make the arrangements to make the print, pass on the cost of that to them. It never leaves the building. She's like, oh, I didn't know that. And I'm saying that things are going off in my mind, like, oh my God, what's going on here? You know, that was sort of the thing that was going on there. And so I had sort of like this roller coaster relationship with the African American Museum there from 92 to 2002. And in the late 90s, when AAAM came to town, I didn't even know about it. Now, every August, I would spend 2 weeks with my grandmother in North Carolina interviewing her, you know, for our family history and researching at the state archives. So my vacation was already planned at the time of conference, and Billingsley called me up and said, Sam, how come you haven't been attending any planning meetings? I said, planning meetings about what? He said, AAAM conference. I said, well, okay, where's it gonna be? Cleveland. And I was like, well, no one told me about it. I said, Bill, I swear, I didn't know anything about it. He said, Nancy didn't call you? That was the director of the African American Museum. I said, no, I've never been invited to a meeting. So he said, okay, we're gonna be meeting at the Sheraton Hotel this day, this time, I want you to be there. It's okay. I show up at the hotel, they surprised to see me walk in, right? So, you know, Nancy plays it off. So Billingsley basically tells her Sam Black needs to be involved. And I said, hold it. I said, you know what? I already had plans to see my 90-year-old grandmother. That's gonna come before AAAM. If I'd have known anything about the conference, I could have scheduled my vacation another time. But, you know, plans are the way they are, you know, can't do anything about it. So there were some things that I worked on. I didn't necessarily have to be there to be able to get it accomplished. But it wound up being a real disaster for the African American Museum, in that the AAAM members who visited that museum, you know, we always had a reception at the host museum, some of them just came away angry and just said that it was an embarrassment. And they were quoted in a local paper. It was an embarrassment. You know, it's almost like you purposely let this place look like this. It's so unprofessional. You know, those of us in Cleveland knew that already, you know, based on the fact that they were reluctant to engage with museum professionals to help them. So that was a lesson I always learned. And the African American Museum there has been closed for most of the 20th century, 21st century. I mean, you know, since the director passed away, I think in between 2005 and 2010, the museum has basically been closed. And although you had the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Western Reserve Historical Society, the city of Cleveland, all at one time or another trying to work with them to advance it, it's like they felt that their independence would go away. So I remember meeting there one morning with the director and then the CEO of the Western Reserve Historical Society, because what happened a few nights before was that there was a city council meeting that was talking about the land on the lakefront that was being provided for, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame had just been built. And then right across the pier from the Hall of Fame was this area that the Western Reserve Historical Society was interested in, because we wanted to move our auto museum to that location and build a brand new facility. We were negotiating with City Council for a 100-year lease of that land for $1 a year. The chair of that committee said, well, what are we going to do for the African American Museum? I'm not going to allow the Western Reserve to get this sweetheart deal for the next 100 years, and the African American Museum still gets nothing. So the agreement by our CEO and the chair of City Council was that our CEO would meet with the director of the African American Museum to work out something that the African American Museum. So I'm invited to the meeting, because why? Because I'm Black. Okay. So I'm invited to the meeting, and our CEO asked her, what would you most like? So I looked around the museum, and I'm trying to telepathically communicate with her, you want assistance, you want money, and you want assistance to raise funds for your infrastructure, your facility, upgrades on the facility, because the ceiling is falling in. And she said, I want some exhibits. And I'm like, why? So anyway, AAAM gets to know Cleveland that way. And although Cleveland is a city, I mean, you can compare other cities that I would say have their game together, comparable in size to Cleveland, like Birmingham, and, Jackson. You're a smaller city, but you got your stuff together down there. Memphis, other places. Cleveland could have had that, in the 60s when Llewellyn was starting his museum, but no one really wanted to invest in anything Black. And they continued to have leadership in that museum who were really not plugged into AAAM. The African American Museum, other than Ed Reeves, the people who followed him were never engaged with AAAM. So there was no professional development in education or how to do things. And that's one of the sad things. So when we came around 2016 to hold the conference in Riverside, I took a lot of abuse. Why? I had Margaret Santiago called me. Margaret had never called me. Margaret Santiago called me. What are you thinking? I live in Puerto Rico. I'm not flying all the way to Southern California, this and that. And I said, there's a museum out there that needs our help. And that's all I said, because, going back to when I joined this organization, one of the things I learned was that the conference was used for a number of different things. And one of those was to provide exposure to the local museum so that it could change, it can become better, it can receive assistance. So even before we got on the ground in Riverside, I had put Riddell Hearn in touch with Miss Love. I can't remember her first name out there, who was the director at that little museum. And I said, they need a consultant. She has some people who are able to pay you. You know, you're a board member at AAAM, but you're also in Los Angeles, between Los Angeles and New Orleans. So you can do this if you have time in Los Angeles. She said, sure, she'll do it. She went there, went visit the museum and everything. So we put them in touch with a number of people. I remember we had lunch. This was during the board, no, the team who, I think it was just me and a few other people. Might have been Aunt Tanisha and someone else. Sort of the conference development team, or I can't remember what we actually called it. So we went to Riverside and I had lunch with Ms. Love and the council president of that small town, Paris, California. And first thing I asked her was what was her budget? And she said she didn't know. I said, that's number one. Just throw out a number. I said, there's a conversation here with people who are looking to help you. Don't say you don't know, go overboard. I mean, it's usually 125,000 a year, but I'm only able to raise 25 or something like that. Then we'll know what your needs are, right? But she said she don't know. So I knew, okay, there's a problem there. But when I found out that all this time that museum was being supported by her parents' Social Security benefits, so I'm like, okay, there's some real instruction that needs to take place here. But they were open. They were like, teach us how to do this thing right, and that's all they really wanted. So when we had our board meeting, I don't know if were you on the board at the time? And you remember the questions? Why don't we go to Los Angeles? Why don't we go to, number one, the California African American Museum would never take us on. The last time they did that was in '84. Well, Lonnie Bunch was a curator there, that's how long ago it was. And I said that, but you gotta see this museum. It really needs our help. This is what we are here for. We're just not here to help the Smithsonian. They don't need our help. What we really need to do is help these mom and pop, one room museums, learn how to do things correctly. We want them to be a success story. And so and people are like, how come we're not staying at the Mission Inn, instead of this place here? Why? Because we get $10,000 discount here at this place, and you just got this short walk through this blazing hot field, but you can get your parasol and everything and walk over there, where the Mission Inn is going to cost us more each night. They're not going to give us that $10,000 discount, and all that type of thing. So it was just a whole bunch of things that went into that. But the main thing, and this is what I talked to Brian about, I said, we've been falling off the cliff with West Coast members. And one of the main things is that there's only certain times a year, people on the West Coast, from the mountain range all the way to the Pacific, are gonna travel east of the Mississippi. So we've really been doing a disservice to our AAA members in Washington, in California, in Arizona, and anywhere west of the Mississippi. And so we need to do better with that. And I said that the main thing I want to do is increase our membership. So Brian came up with all these offers and discounts. He talked to Debbie Mack and got the African American Museum to underwrite travel vouchers or whatever, to get people there. And we were able to do that, increase our West Coast membership. I had people from African American Museum in Fresno calling me about the conference in Riverside, all types of things that people had never heard from before, didn't even know a museum existed there. And so those were some of the things that, Riverside wasn't the most glamorous place. I remember in the hotel in Riverside, I get pulled aside. No. It was the year before in Memphis. the new director of the California African American Museum, after Charlene Jefferson retires, he was on their board, then moved into the executive director position, pulled me aside in Memphis and said, "Why are you going to Riverside, man? You don't know about Riverside." It's like people who can't afford to live in LA live in Riverside. So I said, "But you guys, you never stepped up to say we will host the conference." I said, "We went to where we thought we could make the most impact, and it is cost effective for us. It's not going to cost our members. How can you go to California, you're paying $99 for a hotel room, Southern California, and I said, but this doesn't mean that we can't be in LA. If you want us to come to LA, then set it up, but it doesn't mean we can't be in LA. We haven't been there since '84, because I said, I've had conversations with Charlene Jefferson about this. And she just talked about the money. It wasn't going to work out, for them. I said, maybe under your leadership, it's a different thing, but the deal is done. We're not going to change our minds about all this. And, he was sort of like, we're not going to come from LA and go to Riverside. And I'm like, just love the organization. Don't care where the conference is, and support the organization. But my thing as president is I really looked at places that we had never been. Only out of necessity did we go back to Birmingham after a couple of years, because Wichita fell out. So we lost Wichita. The other places we had never been were Memphis. Memphis. Of course, Riverside, Baltimore. We did that in 2012. We were in Tallahassee in 2011. Charlotte in 2013. I can't remember where we were in 2014. But that was part of my presidency of places. And I had a whole list of places I was wanting to go, and I turned that over to Brian when I left office. Houston, Texas was on there. Indianapolis, Detroit. We even had Canada on there, Nova Scotia on there. There was a guy named David, what was David's name? I can't remember his last name, but he was a tenured professor at, I can't remember the university up there in Hamilton, Nova Scotia. And he was coming to AAAM conferences and Asala. He presented at Asala. He put me on a panel at the Canadian consulate in Atlanta when Asala was there in 2006 to talk about these African American and Canadian connections. And I later told the board we ought to think about Canada as a place to hold our conference in August. But he unfortunately was in a very bad car accident, and he had to retire from teaching, so that sort of put the kibosh on that. Those are things, that's what I was thinking. And so, I had nothing against Birmingham, DC, places that we had to go to out of necessity, because it was quick turnaround, it was easy to organize, the sort of the infrastructure was already there to manage the conference and everything. And we knew we weren't going to get anything out of those places. We just didn't want to go into debt, and we went to Birmingham, was that 2010? No, 2010, we were here in Pittsburgh. Whatever year it was, we went there because Wichita fell out, and we had less than a year to organize the conference. And so Peugeot stepped in and was able to, help us do that conference. We had a lot of fun there, and the good thing about the conference is that the academic portion of it has become much more meaningful each and every year. You know, you know, I can remember in the 90s, it's all this, this is the exhibit my museum did, and, you know, and that type of thing, or, you know, someone doing a panel selling their book, you know, or something like that. But, you know, it's like, I would say that really since about maybe 2005, the academic portion of the conference has gotten sharper each and every year. To the degree, if you miss AAAM, you're gonna miss out on some real enrichment and education that you're not gonna find anywhere else. You're not gonna find it at AAM as much as AAM try. But if you look at those panels at AAM, those are AAAM members doing those panels, you know, for AAM. And but you know, the value as AAAM has become increasing, you know, and that was one of the things that, you know, as president, I didn't want to take any steps backwards. I wasn't willing to do that. You know, how we were able to survive pretty much for 2 years without any funding, you know, and I would tell the board, you know, we have really got to get this right, because, you know, with the IRS suspending our 501c3, then, you know, we're limited in what type of financial support we could get. And there were very few entities out there who would grant us money without us having our nonprofit status. And so we had, you know, a group of people, including myself, working on that. And then on the other hand, we had a group of people just working on the program itself and making sure that that was done correctly. You know, it hasn't always been a smooth ride. There's been disagreements on how we should do things. You know, I mean, there were times in the early 2000s, I wasn't going to quit the board, but I just didn't find any value in the cursing, you know, and everything at the board meeting. I mean, it was getting, you know, there was some things, I thought she was a sweet old lady until I get to this board meeting, you know, and then you really let people have it, you know, that type of thing. But, you know, it was, I remember my first board meeting, and there were people at each other's throats. And then at the end of the board meeting, they said, you know, maybe, I think it was Guatney who might have said, maybe we should be a little nicer. So Sam's first day, we won't send him out of here running. You know, he might not come back to the board, you know. So I said, nah, you know, I mean, I'm one of 13 children. You know, that doesn't, you know, group dynamics like that don't bother me. You know, it's unnecessary. You know, I think we can get more things accomplished without that, but, you know, people got to have room to be able to express themselves however they see fit, you know, as long as there are no punches thrown, you know. But, and I participated in those too, you know, so I'm not like a bystander. But the whole thing was that, you know, that's also indicative of the type of passion that people may have for the organization. And you have to embrace that passion. And that's one of the things that I saw over and over again. I always go by my first conference in '92 and what I experienced. It was a reception at the National Afro-American Museum in Wilberforce. And I met for the first time John Fleming, John Franklin, Harry Harrison. I met Harry Robinson. I met all those, Margaret Burroughs. I met all of those people. A lot of them are gone now. Joan Maynard from Weeksville, Bedford Stuyvesant. I mean, some of them are not deceased, they're just, retired and everything. But I also met Margaret Santiago, who passed away. And, just people who have been in the profession for decades before I arrived. And, so they were holding up the torch when the torch wasn't even lit. And I had nothing but just respect for them, and to be able to meet them in person and see how genuinely, how nice they were. Rowena Stewart was another one. Now Rowena was tough, but one-on-one conversation, she was beautiful. She was an educator, and she was just so interested in what you were doing. And I remember the conversations she and I would have just on the bus as we went to a reception or something like that. Those are things that I just can't sit aside. Whenever I think of AAAM, I think of all of that, what I learned from the very beginning. And I see now, that, I'm considered a senior in the field, still trying to, wrap my hands around that. But the reality is there, I'm like, wow, next year will be 30 years for me. And it's been a long, long journey. So I am really pleased, because this is some of the things we talked about in our board meetings with getting younger. There's a lot of good, talented young people coming in this profession, and they need room to express themselves. It's like every time I go to a sala, Sylvia Cyrus asks, when you coming back to the executive council? That's not my role anymore. I did my time. There's a whole new generation of people, with 21st century ideas. I was born in the 20th century. 21st century ideas that could really help this organization. People, it's like the struggles I have with my daughter and my son primarily over their internet use. If you let them, it's a 23.9 hour a day thing. They would get that 1 minute of sleep in, and then right back at it. Personally, I don't know what's that engaging, but I acquiesce with them a lot, because that's all they know. That technology is what they were born with. I wasn't born with the technology. The technology came along when I was an adult. But for them as children, that's all they really know. And so instead of fighting with them, I try to guide them into doing things that are constructive, do things that are innovative, with this technology. Don't just entertain yourself, but find a way to advance yourself and advance your thinking using this technology. And it's starting to work out a little bit. My daughter doesn't gripe when I put a 2-hour limit on, do your homework first, then you get 2 hours, do whatever you want on the internet, your social media, whatever it is that you want to do. My son, he was starting his freshman year in college, and I just talked to him last night. Now he understands, well, the professor gives us this writing assignment, and then we've had 2 or 3 classes, and he hasn't mentioned anything about. I said, that don't mean he forgot about it. This is not high school. He's not gonna spoon feed you your paper. You gotta go out there and do the research, write the daggone thing, do a couple of drafts, go to the writing center, all these things that's how college works, my man. This is not high school anymore. He's not gonna ask you every day, Aku, how's your paper coming? Anything I can help you with? He has too many students. you know? So he's like, oh, okay. I'm like, yeah, yeah, it's a different thing. And that's what I saw in AAAM is all these younger people coming, and they're really bright. And have some great ideas, and their ideas might be different from yours. And that's okay, So I just hired my first full-time curator. She starts on the 27th, but she has all the credentials, she has the museum studies graduate degree and all this type of stuff, but just was unlucky finding a job that she felt comfortable in. So we're gonna bring her to Pittsburgh, and she seems to be bright. She's just, I mean, from the outset, she's bright. I've seen some of her work. She was my intern this summer, remotely. She's in Atlanta and she's my intern in Pittsburgh. And she did things. I gave her the project and she ran with it. And I said, wow, if we mess up and don't bring her here, I think we're gonna miss out on something, because she has the energy, she has the ideas. All she needs is the experience, to go with that. She's gonna be a really good curator. And so we're bringing her in on the 27th. Hopefully she'll have a long career with us. But it's the beginning of a number of different hires I'm going to make over the next 3 or 4 years as we advance our program through that whole museum project. And it's going from a program to a museum within a museum, we're calling it. And we're looking at restructuring our capital campaign to make room for this museum project. And it's going to temporarily be housed on one floor of our existing history center, but we've bought pretty much the block behind us and going to develop a whole new thing. We're talking about putting a hotel there, a new visitor center, collection storage, an education center, classrooms and all that stuff, and possibly the Museum of African American History. So we're off to a really good start. And I'll tell you, I have to admit, I know for a fact, because there was a time I was looking at moving away from the museum field. And I remember having a conversation with Debbie Mack about that. And Debbie's like, oh, no. And I said, no, my interest is starting to go somewhere else. And then that's when I realized that, I really do love museums. I just need to re-energize myself. And I think this museum project is going to do that for me individually, but it's going to have a great impact on our community. And, just a few people, especially some of our board members that I talked to about it, they're really excited. So all I need is for them to open their checkbook and show me how excited they are. You can't be too pushy, even if they are your board members. You can't be too pushy. You have to know when to ask. So I'm planning a number of brainstorming sessions to take place over the next 4 or 5 months, as we move to a point where we're going to publicly announce the museum. So there's still some things we need to do, to get our foundation together. But it's already sanctioned by our board to move forward with it, which means to me that we'll find the money for it, and then we're going to phase it out, in maybe 2 or 3 phases. But it's just real exciting. And that was one of the things I talked to this new curator about. You have an opportunity here to be involved in something brand new. So, there's a certain amount of it that you can develop in your own interests. And I'll give you the freedom to do that. I trust you to do it right. I'm not going to just totally let you go. but under my supervision. But I think that you have some ideas. You can tap into the 21st century better than I can, and so that's the whole thing. And she's going to be working on a whole big digital project. And that's what I told her. I said, that's where we're weak at. And we could really, increase our visitorship, our digital visitorship, as well as our in-person visitorship through further developing this. So those are some of the things I'm looking at. And I see AAAM just got another grant. I mean, that is just, that is just all these years when we knew, we need a full-time executive director. We need somebody else here because we're all working our 9 to 5. So there's a limit to how effective we can be. So we have to get it right where we are. But with staff, and I was telling Vedette, Billingsley, I don't really count as being an executive director. He was basically just managing things, holding things together in a sense. But in the early 90s, there was a woman named Roslyn Hubbard. And Roslyn was the last full-time executive director that AAAM had. I think Roslyn retired, she got married or something like that, and retired around 94 maybe. And so we had been without a full-time person, a real full-time professional executive director since the early 90s. And although the pandemic has hit and slowed things down a bit, but the fact that AAAM, out of all the organizations, I think AAAM did the best with its virtual conferences. I think it did the best. It was less cumbersome. It was much more, just even the cost was friendly. It just didn't have, although I love Asala, and I've told Sylvia this, when we were in Charleston, what was that, 2019 with Asala, because they made a few tweaks in the register. Here I am, been registering for the conference for 20 years. All of a sudden I get down there, I'm not even registered for the opening night reception. They wouldn't let me in. And I'm like, Sylvia, what's going on? They have to look up my registration. Oh, you registered for the wrong thing. I said, but I did it the same way I always do it. She said, no, we changed it up. Don't change anything for somebody like me, And I'm like, damn. So I had to pay right out of pocket. I said, I don't mind doing that. It's a cost I would have paid anyway. I said, but, I went away thinking there has to be a simpler way of doing this, and AAAM has always tried to make it as simple as possible. And even in the virtual world, it is very simple. You go online, you register, you receive the information, the conference starts, you click the button. That's all you have to do, And I'm like, this is so easy. Why is it difficult for some of these other organizations? I don't know. But again, that goes into the value of AAAM, and that value keeps going up. And I know you've noticed we've gotten people who really rarely cross paths with anything related to Black museums, but they see a value in AAAM, regardless of that it's the Association of African American Museums. This panel here that they're offering, I need to be at that panel, and that's what we had always dreamed of, and that's what we had argued about back in '92, was that, the future is not going to be this organization as the domain of Black museums. It's going to be this organization as the domain of anything related to the Black museum field, including professionals, including subject matter, including collecting interests, consultants, all these things that are part of the museum field. That's what the future of AAAM is going to be, and that's where I see it playing out.
We've had a long conversation, Sam. I love this. It's so amazing. And I will say I've always been grateful that AAAM has accepted me and brought me in kind of a warm embrace from day one as a white man coming into this field. And you, Sam, I think I've told you before, you were the one who invited me. You were the very first who ever said to me and my staff when we came to visit you in Pittsburgh many years ago, you said you need to come to AAAM. And ever since then, it's become the most important organization for us. I'll also say it always impacted me to see the fact that you were intentional about bringing your children to AAAM every year and having them around that excellence and all of that. But look, we could continue this for a very long time. You know, my students, I mean, we're collecting these in the Margaret Walker Center oral history collection, so it's going to live there. But I have students who are going to be listening to this as well. And I was hoping maybe we could just close this out by just one last question about kind of your vision for now, the future of this field after what you've seen happen to it, and recommendations for them and others who are coming into it.
I would say that in my vision of the African American museum field, I think it's very bright. And that's an interesting thing to say in the middle of this pandemic when there are museums that have closed, environmental issues where museums and historic sites have been damaged by weather, tornado, flood, otherwise. Museums have been damaged by social protest, and many have closed their doors for a number of different reasons. The reason I say that about AAAM is that AAAM knows and understands that it is not a museum, but it is an organization that provides service for museums and museum professionals. So it is the best organization set up to help sustain museums and help museums recover from the damages, whether it's economical, environmental, or otherwise. And the fact that you're able to have a congregation of museum professionals who do different things. Someone like Jeff Hayward, who has these research skills and is able to collect the data and do all those types of things. He has shown a real service. I look at people like Chris Dannemeyer, who had volunteered his marketing skills to this organization for years. You look at all these conference program booklets. I don't know, for maybe a 10 or so year period, Chris Dannemeyer was designing those without fee. People who have helped build the organization to that degree have made it all worthwhile. And that's one of the things about AAAM is that whether you intend to do it or not, if you're around the organization long enough, you subconsciously begin to understand that your role is one to give to the organization as best that you can. And people do it a number of ways. Margaret Burroughs, for decades, provided people gifts of her art, but she also provided money, for people just to help them individually or institutionally. And then there's so many others. As long as John Fleming has been around, being a mentor to hundreds of us. The same thing with Lawrence Pigeot, and Gabriel Tanabe, and others. Just people who, I don't know if you can find this in other professions, maybe you can, but it is really the bright part of the museum field, is that museums survive because the stuff that we collect and preserve have to survive, and it can't survive without us. And so there is a type of nurturing that goes on. AAAM just happens to be sort of the place where a lot of this nurturing either develops or that it evolves, but there's nurturing that goes on in the museum field, even for those outside of AAAM. When I do speaking engagements and they say, oh, I'm a former president of the Association of African-American Museums, people go, ooh, I feel like, yeah, I'm a part of something that's real good, because of what it has done and built the reputation, of being, other than, expectations. I remember doing, when I was president, a number of interviews for NPR, big city newspapers like the Washington Post or the Chicago Sun-Times. And they would always, their intent is to get dirt on African-American museums. I did one for the Baltimore paper, Baltimore Sun, about the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. And their intent was to get dirt on the Reginald F. Lewis Museum by asking me questions that about the financing of Reginald. I'm like, I'm not on the board there. I don't work there. How would I know about their financing? I didn't review any public documents or anything like that. All I know is that it's a well-run museum by people who I respect, and is a real asset to the city of Baltimore. What is your next question? That type of thing, but that comes par for the course. You're Black in America, it doesn't matter how good you think you're doing. There are people out there who want to chop you down a couple of notches and will find any angle to do that. But AAAM has been a real bright, shiny spot because there are people who may not be as active as members, may not attend the conferences every year, but they have AAAM's back. The top museum man in the world now is a AAAM member. So there's real cachet in the organization. And it basically, I look at it as that, there was a lot of plowing in the field in the 80s and in the 90s and the early 2000s and everything. And now we're starting to harvest, the growth of what we had planted all those decades before, and righteously so. So I really do feel that I'm not naive. There are some things that have impacted museums, and primarily financial. But I think it's very strong, and the reason why is that there are a number of people, young people, who are looking for a way into this field. I know when I hired my curator, I'm hiring one person. I had 163 applicants for one position. That tells me that there are hundreds of people out there, and each year that number increases, who are looking to come into the museum field. And that is a new generation of folk who are going to advance the museum field 20 years into the future, 20 years and beyond into the future. And so there needs to be room for them. And some of them are doing dynamic things that should have been done years ago, or doing them different ways. You look at these organizations like Museum Hue that are impacting the integration and diversity in museum visitorship, which is then impacting what museums offer in terms of programming, exhibition, and collections. During the social protests, because I'm a Fulbright Germany member, I was writing an article with 2 German colleagues on diversity and inclusion in museum programming in both Germany and the United States. And we were sort of focusing on reparations as a practicum of diversity. Kind of hard to do, but in the short space they gave us in the Journal of Museum Education, we were able to do this. But to learn from them that the same sort of dynamic that is taking place in the United States is also taking place in Germany in terms of diversity and integration of those who are looked upon as others or less than. And looking at what role do our museum institutions and cultural institutions play in the whole humanity scheme, of providing space righteously for everyone and not just those who are in control. But sort of changing the whole dynamic of how we see ourselves as museums. And so it's a global thing. It's not just an American thing. And it's not just an African-American thing, but there's a lot to learn from what others are doing, and other foreign countries are doing just as much as what we're learning from each other in different states here in the United States. So I feel very confident in the future of the museum profession. And I feel extremely confident in the direction that AAAM is going.
Thank you, Sam. I'm grateful for your being here today. This has been fabulous. I may have to call you back and revisit because there's a lot more we could talk about, but this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, my wife's in South Carolina on a research trip. My daughter's in school. My son's away at college. I'm working from home. I'm pretty lonely at times. So yeah, if you want to do this again and follow up or whatever, I'm down for it.
That sounds great. Thanks.
Okay. All right.